Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of True Japanese Horror. I'm your narrator, and tonight I want to share something that happened in the mountains of Gifu Prefecture just 2 years ago. This story reached me through a network of temple keepers and local historians who document incidents that most people prefer to forget. Before we begin, I need you to understand something about rural Japan. Deep in the mountains, scattered between ancient cedar groves and forgotten valleys, you'll find thousands of small temples. Most honor local deities, ancestral spirits, or Buddhist saints who've watched over communities for centuries. These sacred places bring comfort, protection, and peace to those who visit them. But not all temples were built for worship. Some were constructed for very different purposes, and in the quiet villages where old traditions still hold sway, locals will warn you about certain places where you should never kneel, never pray, and never speak the names carved into weathered stone. Tonight's story centers around one such place, and a man named Ryo Nakamura who discovered too late why some doors should remain forever closed. Ryo was 28 years old, born and raised in Tokyo's endless concrete sprawl. For years he'd worked at a marketing firm, grinding through 14-hour days under fluorescent lights, surviving on convenience store meals and vending machine coffee. The city had consumed him slowly, the way cities do, until he found himself hollow and exhausted, moving through life like a ghost haunting his own existence. When the company restructuring came in March, Ryo wasn't surprised to find his name on the termination list. He'd been sleepwalking through projects for months, his creativity buried under layers of fatigue and quiet desperation. The severance pay would last maybe 3 months in Tokyo, but his savings account looked as empty as he felt inside. That's when his Uncle Kenji called. Uncle Kenji had always been different from the rest of the family. While Ryo's parents chased success in the city, Kenji had chosen a quieter path, studying at Buddhist temples before eventually retiring to a small house in the mountains. He lived alone now, tending a modest garden and maintaining the grounds of a local shrine that served the scattered farming communities in the valley. The phone conversation was brief. Kenji's voice carried the same gentle certainty it always had. "Come stay with me for a while," he said. "The mountain air will clear your head. You can help with the spring cleaning at the shrine, earn a little money, and figure out what comes next." 2 weeks later, Ryo found himself on a narrow train, winding through valleys he'd never seen, watching rice paddies and traditional farmhouses slide past the window like scenes from an old photograph. The last leg of the journey required a bus that stopped running after 6 in the evening, carrying him deeper into mountains where cell phone signals grew weak and the air tasted of pine and distant rain. Uncle Kenji met him at the bus stop in the village center, looking exactly as Ryo remembered him from childhood visits. Gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a faded work shirt and the kind of calm expression that suggested he'd found something in these mountains that most people spend their entire lives searching for. The house sat on a gentle slope overlooking the valley, surrounded by bamboo groves and carefully tended vegetable gardens. It was traditional but well-maintained, with sliding paper doors that caught the afternoon light and wooden floors that creaked in a comforting rhythm under their feet. That first evening, as they shared a simple dinner of rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables, Kenji explained the local geography with the patient detail of someone who'd spent years learning every trail and landmark. The village itself was small, maybe 60 families spread across the valley floor and lower slopes. Most residents were elderly, their children long since departed for cities and careers that didn't exist in places like this. The main shrine where Kenji helped with maintenance sat at the valley's heart, serving as a gathering place for festivals and ceremonies that marked the changing seasons. But deeper in the mountains, Kenji explained, hidden among the ancient trees, some older places remain were forgotten completely, reclaimed by moss and time. Others were remembered but avoided, their stories passed down through generations of whispered warnings. As he spoke, The sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and the valley filled with that particular silence that only exists far from cities. No traffic, no sirens, no constant hum of electrical transformers, just the soft whisper of wind through bamboo and the distant call of evening birds settling into their roosts. It was peaceful in a way that made Rio realize how long it had been since he'd heard actual silence. The next morning brought his first real conversation with the locals. Kenji had introduced him to Mrs. Tanaka, who ran the village's only store, and her husband, who maintained the local trails for the occasional hikers who ventured this far into the mountains. They were kind people, curious about life in Tokyo, but not envious of it. As Rio helped them reorganize inventory and sweep the store's wooden floors, the conversation naturally drifted to the surrounding landscape and the places worth exploring during his stay. That's when Mrs. Tanaka mentioned the paths he should avoid. There were practical warnings, of course. Certain trails became treacherous during spring rains, and others led to cliffs where careless hikers had fallen in previous years. But when she mentioned the old temple deeper in the forest, her voice carried a different kind of caution. Okamura-dera, she called it, a place where the forest grew too quiet and the shadows fell wrong even on sunny days. Her grandmother had told stories about that temple, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. None of them good stories. Don't go looking for it, she said simply. Some places are better left alone. Ryo nodded politely, but curiosity had already taken root in his mind, like a seed finding fertile soil. Over the following days, Rio settled into a routine that felt foreign after years of urban chaos. He would wake with the sunrise, help his uncle tend the vegetable garden, then spend afternoons cleaning and maintaining the main village shrine. The work was simple, but satisfying in ways his Tokyo office job had never been. The shrine itself was beautiful in its weathered simplicity, wooden beams darkened by decades of mountain weather, stone steps worn smooth by countless visitors, and a small courtyard where cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom. Local families would stop by throughout the day, lighting incense, leaving small offerings, and bowing their heads in quiet prayer. But as peaceful as these days were, Mrs. Tanaka's warning about Okamura-dera lingered in his thoughts like a splinter he couldn't remove. During his morning walks through the forest paths, he found himself scanning the tree line, wondering what lay deeper in those shadows between the ancient cedars. His uncle seemed to sense this growing curiosity. One evening, as they sat on the wooden porch watching fireflies dance above the garden, Kenji spoke without prompting. "The temple you're thinking about has a history that goes back 300 years, he said quietly. It was built by a man named Okamura Jishin, a merchant who came to this valley after losing his family to plague in Edo. He was consumed with grief, desperate to communicate with the dead. The local priests wouldn't help him, so he built his own place of worship in the deepest part of the forest." Kenji paused, lighting a cigarette with hands that remained perfectly steady. People say he performed rituals there that no Buddhist temple would sanction. Offerings meant to call back spirits who should have been allowed to rest. For months, villagers reported seeing lights in the forest at night, hearing voices that seemed to come from underground. "What happened to him?" Rio asked. "They found his body at the altar one morning, kneeling as if in prayer. But his face," Kenji continued, exhaling the evening smoke into air, "was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The kind of fear that comes from seeing something that should not exist in this world." The days that followed felt different for Rio, though he couldn't quite explain how. The mountain air still carried the same crisp scent of pine and distant rain, but something had shifted in the quality of silence that settled over the valley each evening. Where before the quiet had brought him peace, now it felt expectant, as if the forest itself was listening. His curiosity about Okamura-dera only deepened after his uncle's warning. During his morning walks along the well-maintained village paths, Rio found his eyes drawn to the narrower trails that disappeared into the deeper woods. Mrs. Tanaka had mentioned the temple was perhaps 2 hours' walk from the village center, following an old path that hunters used to take before the deer population moved to other valleys. On the third morning after his conversation with Kenji, Ryo made his decision. He packed a small bag with water and rice balls, told his uncle he wanted to explore the mountain trails, and set off before the morning mist had fully cleared from the valley floor. The path began innocuously enough, winding through familiar bamboo groves and stands of cedar that he'd grown to recognize over his weeks in the mountains. But as he climbed higher, following what appeared to be an old stone marker system, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and more ancient, their canopy so thick that even the mid-morning sun barely penetrated to the forest floor. It was in this deeper woodland that Ryo first noticed the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of the valley evenings, but something more complete. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects, just the soft sound of his own footsteps on the moss-covered path and the whisper of his breathing in the still air. After nearly 3 hours of walking, he found it. Okamura-dera sat in a small clearing where the ancient trees formed a natural circle, as if they had been planted specifically to frame this forgotten place. The temple was smaller than Ryo had expected, perhaps the size of a modest family home, but its architecture spoke of careful craftsmanship despite centuries of neglect. The wooden walls had weathered to a deep silver gray, and moss crept up the supporting pillars like green fingers reaching toward the curved roofline. Paper screens that should have covered the windows had long since rotted away, leaving dark openings that seemed to watch him as he approached. What struck him most was how perfectly preserved everything appeared beneath the surface decay. The stone steps leading to the entrance showed no cracks, the carved wooden details remained sharp and clear, and even the small bell hanging from the eaves looked as though it might still ring if touched by wind. Ryo circled the temple slowly, taking in every detail. The characters carved into the wooden beams were unlike anything he'd seen at other temples, flowing in patterns that seemed almost organic, as if they had grown from the wood itself, rather than been carved by human hands. At the rear of the building, he discovered a small cemetery. Perhaps a dozen stone markers stood in neat rows, their surfaces worn smooth by weather but still legible. Most bore family names he didn't recognize, along with dates that stretched back over 2 centuries. But one marker was different from the others, larger and more elaborate, with fresh flowers placed at its base despite the temple's apparent abandonment. The name carved into this stone was Okamura Jishin, along with the year of his death nearly 300 years ago. Below the name, in smaller characters, were words that made Ryo's skin prickle. He who sought to bring back what should remain at rest. Standing there among the weathered graves, Ryo felt the weight of absolute silence pressing against his eardrums. Even his own heartbeat seemed muffled in this place, as if the air itself absorbed sound before it could travel. He approached the temple's main entrance with growing unease. The wooden doors, though darkened by age, showed no signs of being locked or barred. They stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond the threshold. Ryo pushed the door open with a soft creak that echoed strangely in the forest stillness. Inside, shafts of dusty light fell through the deteriorated roof, illuminating an interior that took his breath away. The altar dominated the far wall, carved from a single piece of dark wood and inlaid with mother of pearl that caught the filtered sunlight like trapped stars. Upon it sat the remains of what had once been an elaborate shrine, a tarnished bronze mirror, 2 thick candles burned down to mere stubs, and a wooden offering bowl that appeared to have been recently cleaned. But it was the walls that truly unsettled him. Every surface was covered in writing, layer upon layer of characters carved, painted, and scratched into the wood. Some looked ancient, others seemed relatively fresh. Names, prayers, dates, and what appeared to be desperate pleas written in hands that shook with emotion or fear. Despite every instinct telling him to leave, Rio found himself drawn to the altar. The silence here was so complete it made his ears ring, and the air carried a faint scent of incense that shouldn't have lingered after so many years of abandonment. He knelt before the altar, not quite sure why he was doing so. The wooden floor felt solid beneath his knees, worn smooth by countless others who had knelt in this same spot. From his pocket, he withdrew a coin, placing it gently in the offering bowl as he whispered a simple prayer for guidance and strength in his uncertain future. The moment the coin touched the bowl, everything changed. The forest silence deepened impossibly, becoming a presence rather than an absence. The dusty air grew cold against his skin, and the light filtering through the damaged roof seemed to dim despite the bright day outside. Most unsettling of all, Rio could swear he heard the faint echo of his own voice continuing to pray, though his lips had stopped moving. He rose quickly and backed toward the entrance, but the temple seemed different now, larger somehow, with shadows that stretched in directions that didn't match the light sources. The writing on the walls appeared to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at it, and the bronze mirror on the altar reflected not his face, but something moving behind him in the darkness. Rio fled. He ran through the forest without looking back, following the stone markers with desperate urgency. The path seemed longer now, winding through sections of woodland he didn't remember passing on his way up. The silence followed him like a living thing, pressing against his back with each step. By the time he reached the village, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. His uncle was waiting on the porch, smoking his evening cigarette with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation. They sat together in the gathering dusk, and Rio told him everything: the temple, the altar, the overwhelming silence, and most of all, the feeling that something had followed him back down the mountain. As he spoke, fireflies began their nightly dance above the garden, but even their gentle light couldn't dispel the chill that had settled in his chest. Kenji listened without interruption until Rio finished his account. Then, in the patient voice of someone who'd heard similar stories before, he began to explain what his nephew had unknowingly done. Okamura-dera was never meant to be a place of worship, he said. It was built as a trap, a spiritual prison designed to contain something that should never have been called into this world. The merchant Okamura had performed rituals there that violated every principle of Buddhist teaching, attempting to force the spirits of his dead family to return from whatever realm they'd entered. But he succeeded in calling something back, Kenji continued. Not his wife and children, but something else that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for an invitation to enter ours. When the villagers found Okamura's body, they understood immediately what had happened. The local priests performed a sealing ritual, binding the entity to that place and forbidding anyone from offering prayers there. The prayers were the key, Kenji explained. Every sincere prayer offered at that altar gave the trapped thing more strength, more substance in our world. That's why the temple appeared so well preserved despite centuries of abandonment. The entity was using the spiritual energy from those offerings to maintain its anchor in our reality. Your prayer tonight wasn't just heard, Kenji said quietly. It was accepted. That night, Rio dreamed of the temple, but in his dream, the building was restored to its original glory, with fresh paper screens and polished wooden floors. Candles burned brightly on the altar, and the bronze mirror reflected not his face, but the face of a man in merchant's robes whose eyes held the absolute terror his uncle had described. He woke to the sound of temple bells echoing across the valley, though he knew the village shrine had no bells that could produce such a deep, resonant tone. The sound seemed to be coming from the mountains, from the direction of Okamura-dera. Over the following days, the disturbances grew stronger. Rio would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that fell wrong even in bright sunlight. The scent of incense would fill his room at night, despite no offerings being made in the house. Most disturbing of all, he began to hear his own voice, whispering prayers in the darkness, though he was certain his lips weren't moving. His uncle watched these developments with growing concern. On the fourth night after Rio's visit to the temple, Kenji sat him down for another conversation. The entity was growing stronger, he explained, feeding off the spiritual connection established by that single prayer. If they didn't act soon, it might gain enough power to break free of the temple entirely. There was only one solution, though it carried considerable risk. Rio would have to return to Okamura-dera and formally withdraw his offering, breaking the spiritual contract he'd unknowingly entered. But approaching the entity again would mean putting himself directly in its power, if only temporarily. They prepared carefully for this second journey. Kenji gave Rio a blessed amulet that had been consecrated at the main temple in the prefectural capital, along with specific prayers to recite if he felt the entity's influence growing too strong. Most importantly, he was to enter the temple, retrieve his coin from the offering bowl, and leave immediately without looking into the mirror or responding to any voices he might hear. The walk back to Okamura-dera took place in the early morning hours, when the mist still clung to the mountain slopes, and the forest felt suspended between night and day. This time, Ryo noticed details he'd missed during his first visit. Scratch marks on tree trunks too high for any natural animal to have made. Patches of ground where nothing grew, as if the earth itself had been poisoned. And everywhere, that unnatural silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water. The temple looked different in the gray morning light. The wooden walls appeared darker, almost black, and the carved characters seemed to pulse with their own dim luminescence. The door stood wide open, though Rio was certain he'd closed it when fleeing the previous week. Inside, changes were immediately apparent. The altar had been cleaned and polished until it gleamed like new. Fresh candles burned with steady flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Most unsettling of all, the offering bowl now contained dozens of coins and small objects. Though Rio knew he'd been the only visitor in years, his own coin was easy to identify among the offerings. A modern 10-yen piece that stood out among the older currency and personal items that filled the bowl. But as he reached for it, the bronze mirror behind the altar began to cloud over, its surface rippling like disturbed water. In the mirror's depths, Ryo saw not his own reflection, but the temple as it had been centuries ago. Candles blazed throughout the interior, and the walls showed no signs of age or neglect. At the altar knelt a figure in merchant's robes, hands pressed together in desperate prayer as tears streamed down his face. The figure in the mirror looked up, meeting Ryo's eyes directly, and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You called to us." We answered. "The contract cannot be broken by mortal hands." The candle flames suddenly flared higher, filling the temple with dancing light and shadow. The writing on the walls began to move, characters flowing like water across the wooden surfaces. And from somewhere beneath the floor came the sound of many voices, all whispering the same prayer in languages Rio didn't recognize. He grabbed his coin and ran, not stopping until he reached the village. But even as he fled, he could hear laughter echoing from the temple, a sound that followed him all the way down the mountain. That evening, as Rio related this second encounter to his uncle, both men realized that the situation had progressed beyond their ability to handle alone. Kenji made phone calls to contacts at temples throughout the region, seeking someone with the knowledge and authority to perform a proper sealing ritual, but it might already be too late. That night, every resident of the valley reported the same dream. A figure in dark robes walking slowly down the mountain paths, stopping at each house to peer through windows with eyes that reflected candlelight, though no candles were burning. In the morning, Mrs. Tanaka's store was found with its door standing open and mud tracked across the floors in the pattern of a temple procession. On the main counter sat a single coin, along with a note written in shaking handwriting, "The debt must be paid." 3 days later, a team of priests arrived from the prefectural temple, bringing with them ancient texts and ritual implements that hadn't been used in over a century. They performed ceremonies throughout the village, blessing every home and shrine, before finally making their way up the mountain to Okamura Dera itself. They found the temple restored to perfect condition, as if time had reversed itself within its walls. The altar blazed with candlelight, the mirror reflected images of people who weren't there, and the offering bowl overflowed with items that villagers recognized as belonging to family members who had died decades ago. The head priest later described what happened during the sealing ritual as the most difficult spiritual battle he'd ever faced. The entity didn't want to be contained again, and it had grown far stronger than the original binding spell had been designed to hold. It took 6 hours of continuous chanting, with all 4 priests working in perfect coordination before they managed to force it back into dormancy. When the ritual was complete, they sealed the temple doors with blessed paper talismans and constructed a new stone barrier around the entire clearing. Warning signs in multiple languages were posted along all the forest paths, and the local authorities were notified to prevent curious hikers from approaching the area. Ryo left the mountain shortly after, returning to Tokyo with a profound understanding of why some places should remain undisturbed. He found work at a different company, rebuilt his life, and tried to forget about his experience in the forest. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the city's constant noise fades to a whisper, he still hears the distant sound of temple bells, and he knows that somewhere in the mountains of Gifu Prefecture, behind sealed doors and blessed barriers, something waits patiently for the next curious soul who might think themselves strong enough to withdraw an offering once given. The priest's sealing holds for now, but as any student of Japanese folklore will tell you, such bindings require constant maintenance and unwavering faith to remain effective. And in a world where fewer people believe in the old warnings, where ancient knowledge fades with each passing generation, even the strongest spiritual barriers can weaken over time. That brings us to the end of tonight's story. I hope it serves as a reminder that not all sacred places are meant for human prayers, and that sometimes the warnings passed down through generations carry wisdom we ignore at our own peril. Thank you for joining me for another episode of True Japanese Horror, and remember, some doors are sealed for reasons that transcend our understanding.